fellow bookworms, to Tippera's Den. My name is Whitney, and we are reading Nora Roberts' Legacy. We actually just finished this book up. We read chapters 26 through 30 this week, which were the last set of chapters. So, as always, if you're not quite to that point, don't hesitate to jump off this video, get caught up. We are discussing these chapters and these characters, and since it is the end of the book, there are some pretty big spoilers. And then, of course, if you haven't started reading this book, it is never too late. I really did enjoy this. I'm not going to give my final thoughts today. It's just going to be the discussion questions. But I will say I really did enjoy it. And so if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend you do. But I will be doing my final thoughts later on in the week. So if you want to check that out, you certainly can do so. And then, of course, at the end of the week, the 29th or the 30th, don't forget to head on over to my website to check out the blog post where we will be doing discussion questions on the whole book. So, but yeah, I really enjoyed it, and let's go ahead and move on. Before we get started into the discussion questions, I just want to remind you, for August, we are going to be reading Stormfront by Jem Butcher. This is the first book in the Dresden Files. And so it might be a reread for some of you. I know it's pretty popular, and so I hope if you have read it, you will read it again with us and participate in the discussion questions. And if you haven't, I strongly recommend you do. I don't really remember the book itself. I remember I enjoyed it, but I don't really remember the book itself, so I'm really excited to reread it and then, finally complete the series, because I only read, like 3 or 4 books in the whole series. And I will also leave the video where I introduce this as a book of the month for August in the description below. And that has all the information on where you can pick it up and the breakdown of the chapters and all that. But we will be starting this week and then discussing the first set of chapters next Monday. So I hope you will join us. And I do also want to add a trigger warning before we get started. There's actually several. There's suicide, miscarriage, assault, and murder that we're discussing in these chapters. So, you probably already know that, since hopefully you've already read the book and you're already to that point. But just be mindful that we are discussing those things that we read. So, first up is chapter 26. Mental health struggles seem prevalent in the Bennett family. Even with those struggles, how important is accountability? And so, just because you struggle with your mental health, it does not excuse any bad behavior. Like, it does not give you the right to hurt anybody or break the law. And so I think, it's important to recognize struggles and the capabilities of people, but at the same time, you still need to hold them accountable for their actions. And so I don't think we see that happen with JJ or Jonathan Jr. I definitely think, that his behavior was excused a lot, not only by his father, but his sister as well. She would try to cover for him, and everything like that. I think, based on reading it, like, his mom would try to kind of hold him accountable, but that would also cause issues with the father as well. And the father didn't hold himself accountable, and we definitely see, that the father definitely struggled with mental health, and was very violent and everything. And then the mother struggled as well. And I think the sister too. We'll kind of discuss that a little bit more in some other questions. So at this point, Nikki's involvement only seems to be financial support and covering / making excuses for JJ's less nefarious indiscretions. If you didn't have sympathy for her before, do you now? And so we had already talked last week, like I had asked if you had any sympathy for her. And I already did at that point, even not knowing her involvement. Like, I could really sympathize with her, and just her own trauma and what she went through. And I think at this point, knowing, she didn't know about the murders or the poems or the fact that her brother killed their mom, I can sympathize with her. And, obviously we know, even now that she's learned about all this, she still instinctively covers for him. But at the same time, like I said, she really tried to distance herself from the negativity of the family and make something of herself. And so I do sympathize with her for sure. And with the video and learning about Rachel, the poet, JJ, seems to have escalated even further, planning on killing 4 women in a short time frame. Do you think he would have snapped anyway? and I don't think he really would have. I think, he was definitely escalating and he was definitely ready to focus on Adrian, and we do see, him slipping up here and there. But I think he wouldn't have snapped, at least not so drastically, um, if Rachel hadn't showed up. Like, I think the video kind of was eating at him and making him even more angry. And so, like I said, he might have kind of escalated a little bit based on that. But I think Rachel was really what caused him to snap, knowing, that she, they, there was an investigation and that they had already learned a lot, about him and his sister. I think that's kind of what caused that final snap, and caused him to escalate so drastically. And the last question for this chapter, Raylan and Adrian finally talk about where they stand. What do you think of Raylan's approach to call out Adrian's flaws? And I enjoyed that whole interaction. Like, I thought Raylan is just very intuitive. And the way he did that, like, she was saying that he didn't know, her flaws or the ugly parts yet. Like, they hadn't been together long enough. And he called her out on that. I was like, I know your flaws, and he pointed them out. But he also pointed out his own flaws. And he did it in such a way it was honest, not hurtful. And I think, I just really enjoyed that whole interaction. And then at the end, he kind of lightened it up, joking about Laura Lee's flaws with Star Wars and Star Trek and all that. So I just really enjoyed that whole interaction. But let's go ahead and move on to chapter 27. Rachel passes on the information she has gathered to the DC police. Do you think they will find Nikki in time? And so obviously we know what happens, but I kind of write these questions chapter by chapter, so that way it's fresh in my mind. And so knowing what happens, at this point, I didn't think they would, or they would have, if it hadn't been for what happens to Rachel. I think, why they were kind of moving forward at this point, I still think they would have kind of drug it out, even maybe another week or so, if not longer. And so I think, that they probably wouldn't have if it hadn't been for what happened to Rachel. So, and this one, I want to add the trigger warning about talking about the miscarriage, because I know that can be kind of upsetting. So, Tracy gives Rachel more information and recalls another woman, Jessica. Why do you think Jessica is not only denying her involvement with Jonathan Bennett, but refusing to acknowledge the risk to herself? And I think really it's the big part of it is just the trauma she went through. She was involved with this professor, ends up pregnant, and when she tells him, he assaults her, and that ends up in a miscarriage. So not only do you have the trauma of the assault, but then the trauma of the miscarriage as well. And I also think there's a religious component there too. I think that plays a big factor. She's from a small town. That's where she's living now as an adult with her husband, who's a pastor. And so I do think there is a religious component there that kind of plays in it. And so she, not even acknowledging that she ever had any involvement. Like, she's shut that down. Like, she's in denial about it. And so in order to acknowledge that she's at risk, because she's on this list of names, means she would have to acknowledge that she ever had any involvement with Jonathan Bennett in the first place. And I just don't think that she's ready to do that. Like, that's how she has coped with the trauma, was completely denying it. So that's why I think she's just kind of, just not acknowledging it, and then not acknowledging the risk to herself either. And Tracy was lax as far as safety measures just in general with being a woman, but also as a target of a serial killer. Did she underestimate the poet and or was overconfident? And I think she was both. Like, I do think she was kind of overconfident in herself. And I'm not placing blame on her, so I don't want it taken that way. But as women, there are certain things we do just to be safe. And I think, she didn't do those things just in general. Like, she would park at the far end of the lot so that way she could get her steps in. And on this particular day, she was leaving later than most of the rest of her coworkers, and she had parked at the far end, and then it was raining and everything like that. And so I do think she was pretty confident in her abilities to take care of herself, and because of that, I think she underestimated the poet. Thinking, if he did attack, she could handle herself. But the fact was, she never had a chance to defend herself because he lay hiding. And so there was no chance to defend herself at all. And so I do think, like I said, it was both. She was a little bit overconfident, but at the same time, she did underestimate the poet for sure. And the last question for this chapter, Adrian didn't realize how long she had a thing for Raylan until Tisha pointed it out. Why did it take her so long to not only acknowledge her feelings, but recognize how long they had been there? And I just think it just wasn't on her radar for two reasons. One, growing up, excuse the puppy barking, but growing up, she just wasn't ever going to go there. That was her good friend's brother. Like, she was not going to go there, and then he was married to Laura Lee, so it's just never an option to her. And so she didn't acknowledge that she had a little crush on him at all growing up. And then also, she never pursued like a serious romantic relationship throughout her adulthood either. And so she never really had to acknowledge those feelings with anybody, let alone, recognize them when she's dating Raylan. So I think that's kind of just two components. Like, it wasn't on her radar at all. So next up is chapter 28. With Rachel's legwork tying everything together and Tracy's murder, do you think the police would have taken more action even without the rest of the events of this chapter? And I think they would have. I think they were on their way to that, but I don't think it would have been as quick. I already kind of touched on this. I don't think they would have acted quite as quick if it hadn't been, for Tracy's murder, and then, Rachel tied everything together for them and kind of connected the dots. And then especially with what happens to Rachel, that really set them off. So I do think they were kind of moving forward, but I don't think they would have acted quite as quickly with all that happens for sure. So the poet / JJ makes a mistake and rushes while trying to kill Rachel. Why did he slip? Why did he slip up so drastically? And Rachel was kind of an impulse kill. Like, we had seen before, his criteria for choosing women and then his process. He would kind of watch them and kind of stalk them, and that way he knew, what they did, and then he would choose a time and place to kill them. That way he wasn't exposed, to anybody else. Like, he could kill them without getting caught. But Rachel was impulsive. He hadn't studied her beforehand, and then he didn't, necessarily choose the time or place. He was just looking for that opportunity on his way to Adrian. And so as such, there was people about, and then he panicked a little bit, and he figured, he had killed her, and so she could just bleed, finish bleeding out, and she would be dead, not realizing, that she was tough, and she was able to call the police and get somebody there and get herself to the hospital because, she was able to call the police before she passed out. So I think that's, just the impulsiveness of it. That's what caused him, the mistakes he made for sure. And JJ thinks he's smarter than the police. What mistakes is he making that could lead to his downfall? And I think, the big one was thinking that the police wouldn't link Tracy and Rachel, which I don't understand because he heard Tracy's name when Rachel was talking to his sister. So I really don't understand how he wouldn't think the police would link that. Or, he underestimated the fact that Rachel had already given the information to the police, So I think he just kind of underestimated them, especially Rachel for sure. And then also it doesn't come into play, but it definitely could have. He takes his sister's car, and he even said that he needed to ditch the car, because it was his sister's car, and the police probably had the information on it at this point. But in the beginning, like, he takes it anyway, thinking that he could bypass any checks. He did whatever he needed to do to bypass any checks. So I think he was just a little bit overly confident. And then even leaving his sister tied up in her home. She was obviously on the radar. Again, just thinking that the police weren't involved and didn't have the information that Rachel did. She was already on their radar, and so he should have, taken her somewhere else or something. But yeah, I think he was just overall just overly confident for sure. And the last question for this chapter: the police are finally securing a warrant. If they get to Nikki in time, do you think she will continue to cover for her brother? So we obviously know what happens. But at this point, I honestly didn't think she would. Um, she might have hesitated, but I thought, not only did she learn about the murders and the fact that he murdered their mom as well, and everything he had done, but he also assaulted her. And so I really didn't think that she would still cover for him. At this point, but obviously we know what happens. But yeah, I didn't think she would. And I'm kind of, and we'll discuss it in further questions. But yeah, I didn't think at that point she would. But on to chapter 29. Even concussed and in pain, Nikki has the wits about her to try and protect her brother. Why does she continue to do so? And so, obviously tailing on the last question. And I think, kind of thinking about it, I think she was kind of, trained that way. Her father put a lot of pressure on her that it was her responsibility to protect her brother. And so I think, kind of, she was just trained that way. And I also, think there was a component where she was trying to keep the peace by covering up what her brother did so that way her mom wouldn't start ranting and then her dad wouldn't get angry. And so it's just kind of ingrained in her at this point. So even though, everything he's done, and the fact that she is, in so much pain and concussed and just kind of out of it, she still has the wits about her to protect him and, think through how to protect him. But yeah, I think it was just kind of ingrained in her growing up. So while the police are questioning her at the hospital, Nikki goes back and forth between clarity and protecting her brother and rambling. Do you think she struggles with mental health or is it trauma related? And I think it's both. I think, based on some of the viewpoints from her before, I think she does struggle a little bit with mental health as well. Because she was a bit rambly in her thought processes after talking to Rachel. And then, why she's tied up, that could have been trauma, but it could also have been her mental health. But at the same time, like I said, she did suffer a big trauma. She's concussed. And so some of the rambling and, thought process being all over the place is definitely probably trauma related. But I do think she also, and JJ even says, to Adrian later on that she's just like their mother without the pills. And so I think that's kind of shows, that she probably struggled with her mental health as well. And what are your thoughts on JJ using a tranquilizer gun instead of flat out killing Sadie? And I was so relieved when he did. And as my mom can attest, I've always been this way. Like, I don't really care about humans, characters in fiction getting killed or anything like that. But don't kill the animals. I've always been that way since I was a little girl. And so I was so relieved that he used a tranquilizer gun. And at first I didn't understand why, but then he says he likes dogs. But then again, he goes on a whole rant about not liking female dogs because there's the B word. And he would only have a male dog, and he wasn't going to get neutered because male dog needed to have his parts and be a man, or whatever that whole rant was. But regardless, I was so happy that he does like dogs, and he did not kill Sadie flat out, even though I think that was a mistake on his part. I was very happy that he didn't and very relieved that he didn't. So, and Adrian, like Tracy, was somewhat lax in safety protocols. When dealing with a threat, how hard is it to balance safety with living your life? And I think it can be really hard. I tend to be more of a worrier, and so I tend to let, being overly cautious get in the way of living sometimes. And I think especially with Adrian, with Tracy, like the threat was fresh. Um, and she was kind of outside her home and such. So I think she could have definitely been more proactive as far as safety protocols. But with Adrian, she's been dealing with the threat for a very long time. She was in her own home. And so, yeah, she made a few mistakes, overall, but she was just living her life at the same time. And I definitely don't blame either woman, obviously, but um, I do think it's hard to kind of achieve that balance, and we saw that with the last couple of the year or so with the coronavirus, the struggle between not letting fear take over and also being safe and as much as possible while still living your life the best you could as well. It was kind of a balance with that. So I do think it's sometimes hard. Like it's easy to lean one way or the other, being overly cautious or not cautious enough. But that's it for chapter 29. Let's go ahead and move on to the last chapter, chapter 30. On the opposite hand of rushing and impulsively attempting to kill Rachel, what mistakes does JJ make because he drags out killing Adrian? And he made several, especially because he didn't kill Sadie. By dragging it out, he allows time for Sadie to wake up. And I think that was a huge mistake because Sadie not only provided a distraction that caused or allowed Adrian to act, but she also then goes and alerts Raylan. And so that was a huge mistake on his part. One, not killing Sadie and then allowing her time to actually wake up. And then also just allowing Adrian time to kind of formulate a plan. I think that kind of goes back to his, thinking he's superior, and he's smarter than everybody else. Adrian's very smart, and she really took her time. Like, she didn't impulsively, try to grab a weapon or anything like that. She really thought about what she could do and what would have the highest chance of succeeding. And so those are kind of the big mistakes. And then allowing time, I mean, he thought he killed Rachel, but that allowed time for Rachel to wake up and alert the police that he was on his way to Adrian. And then, also, again, Sadie went and got Raylan. And even if Sadie hadn't learned Raylan, there's no, he might have stopped by. I'm getting all over the place, but he might have stopped by on his own. And so just dragging it out, allowed time for all those things to happen for sure. And Sadie alerts Raylan, have you ever had a Lassie moment with a dog? And I've had two. Once I listened, once I didn't. And the first one was I was a teenager. My mom was working for a horse trainer, and I was down, like, it was a big property, and I was down feeding the horses down in the lower pasture, and I could barely hear him. I don't even know how I heard him because it was far enough away, like, it shouldn't have even registered. But I just hear our dog barking, my mom's dog Bubba. I just hear him barking, and the tone was off. So not only did I hear him, but I could tell that the tone was off, and so I just knew something was wrong. So I dropped the feed. I had a wheelbarrow with feed in it. I just dropped that, and I hauled Butt back up. And my mom had been grooming a stallion, and when she went to untie him, he reared up and reacted, and he ended up jerking her shoulder out of the socket, dislocated her shoulder. So it was just a huge mess. But just the fact that I heard Bubba and I knew something was wrong, that was a big Lassie moment. And then recently, just a month or so ago, our cat got out, and we live in the country. There's lots of coyotes, hawks, so our cats are strictly indoors. And I had gone to the grocery store. I'm pretty sure this is when he got out. I had gone to the grocery store, and I think he got out. And it was a day, so he was probably out 2 nights. Because I went to the grocery store the whole next day, and then the following day, the dogs were acting for they were digging under the house, especially my one dog, Boo Boo. We have rabbits, and so I didn't really think anything, but even with rabbits, they don't dig that incessantly. I could tell them, leave it alone, and they'll kind of disperse. But they were just incessant about it. And I never see little Watson. He doesn't really like me all that much. He's definitely more of my husband's cat. And so I, just didn't really think anything about not seeing him around because he really doesn't come out when it's just me. And then he'll come in and sit on my husband's lap and such when he gets home. but yeah, the cat was out and the dogs were trying to get to the cat, and so I felt really bad because I didn't recognize, but I just thought it was a rabbit, even though they never act that way when it is a rabbit. So those are my two Lassie moments. And then, what are the things that allowed Adrian to buy time, giving Raylan and Monroe more opportunity to get to her? And so she didn't even know they were coming, but I think, one, again, she didn't rush, and she kind of, kept JJ talking. Like, she kept trying to keep him talking while she kind of formulated a plan, and she didn't rush anything, and she waited for that opportunity when Sadie kind of distracted him, to get away. And then she used, her breathing and moving silently, like everything her whole career is built on. She was able to utilize those skills and move silently, and knowing the house too, and move silently and keep him trailing her while she kind of formulated a plan further. And then she was also smart about once she decided what she was going to do, because she knew if she went out through the deck doors and down, he would shoot her. And so she made him think she went down, but then she attacked him. And so just, really taking her time with it and giving herself the best chance to succeed, really, dragged it out and allowed time for Monroe and Raylan to get there, and then along with the police as well. So, and the last question, a big spoiler, but at this point, you should have already read the book and you should know, Nora Roberts, how it's going to end. But Raylan proposes. How wise do you think it is to make a decision like this after a traumatic event? And normally you shouldn't make any big decisions after a traumatic event, when your emotions are heightened or anything like that. But I think in this case, they've known each other for their whole lives, and, well, not their whole lives, most of their lives. And Raylan in particular knows how important it is to utilize the time you're given. He lost Laura Lee in a shooting. And neither one of them are really rash. And so I think, he's secure in his feelings, and I think even though she kind of struggles and doesn't know, doesn't really want to acknowledge, she's acknowledged her feelings at this point, but she doesn't really know what to make about making a family or anything like that. But again, she's not rash. She's pretty logical. So once they make that decision, I think, that they really, it wasn't a rash decision is the point I'm getting at. I know I'm really rambly today, but yeah, I think, normally, yeah, you wouldn't make such a big decision after a traumatic event. But in this case, they, again, have a solid foundation. And it's really not a rash decision with as long as they've known each other and everything like that. So that is it for all the discussion questions. Again, I will be giving my actual final thoughts on either Thursday or Friday. It just depends. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell notification so you are notified when I do post videos, especially bonus videos. And other than that, I hope you will go ahead and pick up Jim Butcher's Storefront. We are reading the first 5 chapters, and we will discuss those next Monday. Happy reading, everyone. Bye.